Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Hello.
So think about the last time you had to go to an emergency room. You probably walked through these automatic sliding doors, stood at a sterile reception desk, and filled out, just a mountain of paperwork.
Right, and then you sit in that brightly lit waiting area.
Exactly. Just listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of heart monitors. We just accept that environment as the absolute standard of medical care today.
It's what we know.
But if you were deathly ill in the ancient world, your intake process looked very, very different. Your prescription might have involved stripping off your clothes, putting on a white robe, and going to sleep in a pitch-black dormitory filled with slithering snakes.
Yeah, quite a different experience.
To say the least.
Yeah.
So today, we are doing a deep dive into tracing the evolution of the hospital. We're going to track how humanity transitioned from those ancient temples of sleep and prayer to charitable monastic refuges, and then all the way to the highly structured secular medical centers of the modern era.
And when you dig into the sources on this, you realize pretty quickly that this is not just a history of medicine.
No, it's really a history of human civilization itself. Because the buildings we construct for the sick, they act like a mirror, right? They reflect how different societies throughout time have chosen to treat their most vulnerable and destitute members.
Yeah, the physical structures a society builds for healing and the specific rules governing who gets to walk through those doors tell us exactly what that society values at its core.
That makes sense.
It does, and we see a clear progression over thousands of years in the sources, but we also see these cyclical patterns in how humans understand the relationship between the physical body, the mind, and the surrounding environment.
Well, to understand where we are today, we really have to travel back to the earliest recorded institutions dedicated to healing, specifically in the ancient Mediterranean world.
Right, going back to the 6th century BCE.
Yeah, to these institutions known as the Asclepiae. These were massive temple hospitals dedicated to Asclepius, the mythological Greek god of medicine. The sources indicate there were over 320 of these centers operating across Western Anatolia and Greece.
In places like Epidaurus, Pergamon, and Kalas.
Right. And they actually remained active all the way until the 6th century. So if I'm a patient in ancient Greece and I fall ill, what exactly is my experience when I arrive at one of these temples?
Well, your experience would be highly orchestrated from the very moment you arrived. The locations of these temples, they were not chosen at random.
They weren't just put in the middle of a city.
No, not at all. They were built in lush, green surroundings, very often on slopes that protected the grounds from harsh, direct winds, and almost always near natural hot or cold springs.
So the location itself was deliberate.
Exactly. The environment was the very first step in the treatment. The Greeks believed that simply removing yourself from the noise and the filth of the city and entering a tranquil space, that actually began the healing process.
And the sources describe this incredibly specific admission ritual. You didn't just walk up to a desk and see a doctor.
No, visitors had to bathe in sacred water first.
Right, which served a dual purpose. Right, physical hygiene and ritual purification. Then they were required to hand over their rings, their belts, their jewelry, basically all personal accessories.
Everything.
And after giving up those worldly possessions, they were given plain white robes to wear. It actually sounds remarkably similar to the modern practice of handing over your street clothes and putting on a generic hospital gown.
Yeah, and it accomplished the exact same psychological leveling. Whether you were a wealthy merchant or a common laborer, once you put on that white robe, you were simply a patient seeking the god's favor.
I see.
Then, the core of the medical treatment involved entering a building called the abaton.
Which was the sacred dormitory.
Right. Here, patients underwent a practice called enkoimesis, which translates roughly to induced sleep. Patients lay down in this communal hall, and while they fell into a deep sleep, the temple attendants would release harmless snakes to slither among them on the floor.
Okay, let's stop right there. Because sleeping in a dark room full of snakes sounds like a literal nightmare, not a medical cure. Why snakes? What is the logic behind exposing sick, vulnerable people to reptiles in the middle of the night?
I know it sounds intense, but you have to view it through the lens of ancient symbolism. In the context of the Asclepian cult, the snake was the ultimate symbol of rejuvenation and healing.
Because it sheds its skin.
Exactly. Because a snake sheds its skin, it was seen as constantly renewing its life force, essentially being reborn. It was intimately associated with Asclepius.
Which is why the modern symbol of medicine is still a staff with a snake wrapped around it.
Precisely. The belief was that during this induced sleep, Asclepius himself, or one of his sacred animals, would visit the patient in a dream. The god would either perform a cure right then and there, or he would reveal the hidden nature of the illness.
And what happened when the sun came up? Did the patients just wake up and say, I feel better now?
Not exactly. When the patient woke up, they would report their dreams to the temple priests, who are known as Asclepiads.
And they functioned as early physicians.
Yeah, they would interpret the surreal imagery of the dreams to diagnose the physical condition, and then, based on that, they would prescribe a highly specific treatment regimen.
But the treatments they prescribed were not just magical incantations. The sources emphasized that they utilized a deeply integrated biopsychosocial approach.
That's a good way to frame it.
I want to break that term down because it sounds like modern medical jargon. Biopsychosocial implies they were treating the biology, the psychology, and the social environment all at once.
Yeah.
What did that actually look like in practice at an Asclepion?
Well, it meant they recognized that the physical body does not exist in a vacuum. If a patient came in with a digestive issue, the priests didn't just give them an herb and send them home. They prescribed a holistic lifestyle adjustment.
Like what?
They prescribed specific diets and herbal remedies for the biology. They prescribed thermal baths and mud baths for physical therapy. But crucially, they also utilized theater, music, and poetry for psychological well-being.
So the entertainment was part of the prescription.
Absolutely. The grounds of these temples included massive stadiums, libraries, and amphitheaters right next to the treatment halls. They were addressing what the Greeks called dieta, which is the root of our word diet.
But it meant more than just food.
Right. For them, it encompassed food, drink, exercise, and the management of the passions of the soul.
Looking at this setup, it feels less like a primitive medical clinic and much more like a high-end holistic wellness retreat you might find today. It seems the ancient Greeks understood the deep connection between a calm environment, mental health, and physical healing thousands of years before modern psychology codified it into medical textbooks.
They absolutely did. And this environment produced some of the most significant medical figures in history. For instance, Eurofon, who practiced in the 5th century BCE.
He was a major figure.
Yeah, he emphasized the crucial role of nutrition in maintaining health. He was also a pioneer in women's health. The sources note him for utilizing an early version of an obstetric stool during gynecological examinations to make the process safer and more comfortable.
And we cannot talk about Greek medicine without bringing up Hippocrates, who lived from 460 to 370 BCE.
No, you can't.
The sources note that he actually trained at the Asclepion on the island of Koch. He is credited with transitioning medicine away from this purely religious framework into a system based on observation and cause and effect. But did he throw out the holistic approach entirely?
No, he refined it. Hippocrates fundamentally shifted the methodology of diagnosis. Instead of relying on a priest to interpret a dream about a snake, he insisted that a physician must meticulously investigate the patient's physical body.
It's very hands-on.
Very. You had to smell their breath, look at the color of their urine, pay close attention to the timeline of their symptoms, and make a diagnosis based on empirical, repeatable observation.
But he kept the environmental focus.
Yeah, he fully maintained that ancient holistic approach, insisting that a good physician must evaluate the patient's entire way of life, their environment, and their emotional state to truly enact a cure.
Now, despite all these holistic ideals about treating the whole person, there is a detail in the sources that feels a bit contradictory. There was a strict exclusionary policy at the Asclepia. Terminally ill patients and pregnant women were expressly forbidden from entering the temple grounds.
Yes, that was the rule.
Why would a massive healing center turn away the exact people who seemingly needed medical intervention the most?
It comes down to two things, really. Religious dogma and institutional reputation. In ancient Greek religion, birth and death were considered ritually impure events.
They generated spiritual pollution.
Right, called miasma. And they believed that would offend the gods and defile the sacred space of the temple. The Asclepian had to remain ritually immaculate at all times. But from a purely practical, cynical standpoint, forbidding anyone who was about to die ensured that the mortality rate within the temple walls remained near zero.
So they were essentially manipulating their own success metrics. By only admitting people with chronic, non-lethal conditions or people who just needed rest and a good diet, they guaranteed that almost everyone who walked out of the temple was alive.
Precisely. It protected the reputation of the Asclepian as a place of successful cures. They were leveraging what we would now call the placebo effect.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, by maintaining an atmosphere of absolute hope where every patient only saw other patients recovering, they maximized the psychological belief in the cure.
That is quite a contrast to what we see later as the Roman Empire rises to power. Around 100 BCE, the Romans began establishing institutions called valetudinaria. But these were not tranquil temples for the general public, were they?
Not at all. The Roman valetudinaria were strictly pragmatic, utilitarian institutions. They were not built for citizens seeking spiritual healing. They were built exclusively for military personnel, gladiators, and slaves.
And the sources highlight the first permanent fort hospital built in the 1st century at Carnuntum, near modern-day Vienna.
Yes. The Roman logic was brutally economic. As their empire expanded across continents, it was no longer logistically feasible to send a sick or wounded legionary all the way back to Rome to recover.
So they built these facilities on the frontiers. The valetudinaria were designed with a single goal: to get valuable assets, trained soldiers, and expensive slaves patched up and back to working condition as quickly as possible.
Exactly. They were highly organized and architecturally sophisticated, often consisting of 4 long wings built around a central courtyard.
What was the benefit of that layout?
This specific layout maximized privacy, it allowed for quiet recovery away from the noise of the military camp, and it provided excellent ventilation. But they entirely lacked the spiritual, holistic, and civic mission of the Greek temples.
So what did normal civilians do?
If you were a regular Roman citizen who fell ill, you were treated at home by the head of your household or a hired physician. The state did not provide hospitals for civilians.
So we see the Greeks focusing on the mind-body connection, and the Romans focusing on fixing the military machine. But I have to ask, is institutionalized healthcare a uniquely Mediterranean invention? Did this concept of building a dedicated place for the sick happen anywhere else independently? Or did the rest of the world just copy the Greeks and Romans?
It's a critical question, and the answer is that early medicine was characterized by massive, continuous cross-pollination.
Really?
Yeah. We see a parallel institutionalization of care developing very early in South and East Asia. You have to remember that Hellenization, driven by the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE, brought Greek medical knowledge deep into Asia.
Right.
And centuries later, during the 7th and 8th centuries, Persian and Arab doctors from the Islamic Caliphate were actively practicing in cities across China. Medical knowledge was always a global exchange, not a localized phenomenon.
So if I am traveling through ancient Asia, am I going to see structures that resemble hospitals? What do the sources tell us about specific institutions?
You would find highly sophisticated institutions. The sources point to early Sri Lanka, where King Pandukapaya built hospitals in his capital city of Anuradhapura as early as the 4th century BCE.
Okay.
Even more striking are the ruins at Mithantale in Sri Lanka, which date to the 9th century. Scholars point to Mithantale as the oldest concrete archaeological evidence of a dedicated hospital structure in the world.
Complete with medical baths and consultation rooms carved into stone, right?
Yes, exactly.
And in the Indian subcontinent, we see state-supported healthcare taking on a highly structured form. Emperor Ashoka is recorded as founding hospitals for both humans and animals around 230 BCE.
Right.
But what really stands out to me is what happens later, during the Chola Empire, which ruled from the 9th to the 13th century. The sources describe a robust system of village dispensaries called Atulasalai. How did a medieval empire afford to provide public dispensaries across countless villages?
The funding mechanism was actually brilliant in its sustainability. These Atulasalai were sustained by something called Vaityavriti.
Which were what?
These were royal land grants, specifically allocated to hereditary medical practitioners. The king would grant a tract of fertile land to a physician's family in perpetuity.
Oh, I see.
The revenue generated from farming that land paid the physician's salary and funded the medicines. This integrated healthcare directly into the local temple economies.
Ensuring that the dispensaries didn't collapse if the royal treasury ran dry.
Exactly. It was a self-sustaining system.
We actually have a very specific vignette from the sources detailing how meticulously these facilities were run. From the year 1067, Emperor Veera Rajendra Chola commissioned an inscription detailing the operations of the Veera Kolasvara Hospital.
Yes, that inscription is incredibly detailed.
It outlines a 15-bed infirmary with a highly specific, rigid staff hierarchy. It mandates the employment of 1 chief physician, 1 surgeon, 2 male herbalists to gather plants, 2 female nurses responsible for feeding the patients and preparing doses, one barber, one washerman, and one waterman.
It's quite the list.
Let me push back on this list for a second. A surgeon and a herbalist make obvious sense for a hospital. But why is a medieval emperor officially mandating the presence of a barber and a washerman on a medical staff?
Well, it shows a profound understanding of hygiene and social structure. In a pre-modern medical setting, maintaining cleanliness was a matter of life and death, even without an understanding of germ theory.
So the washerman.
The washerman ensured that linens were constantly boiled and cleaned, which prevented the spread of superficial infections.
And the barber.
The barber was essential not just for cutting hair to prevent lice, but barbers historically performed minor surgical procedures.
Like bloodletting or lancing boils?
Right. Additionally, in the context of the Indian subcontinent, providing a dedicated waterman ensured that patients received clean drinking water in a manner that respected complex social and caste rules regarding ritual purity.
It functions like a well-oiled machine. We also see the influence of Buddhism shaping healthcare in Southeast Asia. Initially, the sources note that Buddhist monastic care was heavily restricted.
Yeah, early on. If a monk fell sick, they were usually treated privately in their own isolated cell by other monks.
But this shifted dramatically.
It did. It expanded into a massive public health initiative under rulers like the Cambodian king Jaivaram in the 7th and the 12th century.
Right.
He established a countrywide system of over 100 hospitals. These were directly associated with Paisaji Guru, the Buddha of healing. He essentially transformed a quiet, inward-facing monastic practice into a vast state-sponsored network of public clinics.
Intertwining spiritual salvation with physical healing.
Yes.
It is clear that across the globe, societies were experimenting with how to institutionalize care. But if we pull our focus back to the Mediterranean and Europe, a massive ideological earthquake occurs that fundamentally changes the entire purpose of the hospital. We are talking about the rise of Christianity.
The shift here is profound and permanent. Following the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the newly empowered Christian church mandated care for the sick and the destitute as a strict moral imperative.
Which was a sharp break from the old Roman model.
Entirely. The Roman model, as we discussed, only provided hospitals for soldiers and slaves, leaving ordinary civilians to fend for themselves. The new Christian doctrine viewed the human body as a temple of the Holy Spirit.
And emphasized caritas charity as a necessary path to spiritual salvation.
Exactly.
This era effectively marks the invention of the hospital as a social safety net. It shifts the focus away from purely medical intervention and asset management and turns the hospital into an act of civic charity. You weren't healing people to get them back on the battlefield. You were healing them because they were children of God.
That was the core philosophy.
One of the earliest and most famous examples of this is the Basilius, founded by St. Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia around 369. The sources describe it not just as a building, but as resembling a small city.
It was massive.
It had housing for the medical staff, separate wards for different ailments, and an unprecedented, strictly isolated section specifically designed for lepers.
St. Basil's initiative was directly rooted in his interpretation of scriptural commands to aid the least fortunate in society, and the terminology that emerges in this era reflects this new mission.
Like what?
Well, we start seeing the term nosocomeia, which derives from the Greek word nosos for disease and komio, meaning to care for. We also see the proliferation of the xenodochium.
Which translates roughly to a shelter for strangers and pilgrims.
Right. These were not specialized surgical centers. They were institutions of ultimate refuge for people who had nowhere else to turn.
We also see female founders taking a very prominent leadership role, which is notable for the ancient world. A wealthy Roman widow named Fabiola founded the very first hospital in the city of Rome in 390.
Yes, she did it as an act of public penance.
Utilizing her immense personal wealth for charitable works and personally nursing the sick. She was followed by other highly influential women like Pulcheria and Pauline, who endowed massive hospitals in Constantinople and Jerusalem.
The true resilience of this new church-led infrastructure was severely tested during the plague of Justinian,
which was a catastrophic pandemic that struck between 541 and 542.
The death toll was staggering. There are estimates of 25 to 50 million people dying across the empire. The secular state infrastructure completely faltered under the weight of the bodies.
But the nosocomeia served as vital refuges.
They did. The monks and nuns implemented early isolation practices by segregating the infected from the healthy. It demonstrated that voluntary, religiously motivated networks could persist and provide organized care even when secular society was collapsing.
So we have this massive network of charity hospitals popping up across Europe. It sounds noble,
Mhm.
but I have to ask about the reality on the ground. If I am a sick peasant in the 6th century and I walk into one of these nosocomeia, what kind of medical care am I actually receiving? Was this a place of healing or just a place to die indoors?
To be intellectually honest, we have to look critically at the severe limitations of this era. The primary purpose of these early Christian hospitals was caring, not necessarily curing.
Okay, so the care was largely custodial.
Yes, you would receive a bed, regular meals, warmth, and constant prayer. While there were some empirical advancements in herbalism, active medical treatment remained entirely secondary to spiritual support.
Because they believed the state of your soul was far more important than the state of your temporary physical body.
Exactly. And furthermore, the complete lack of understanding regarding germ theory meant that these well-intentioned institutions frequently became massive vectors for disease.
Just because of how they were set up.
Right. You had severe overcrowding in shared wards, with patients suffering from different contagious diseases placed in beds right next to each other.
Oh, wow. I mean, that is a recipe for disaster.
It was. Combined with rudimentary hygiene, this facilitated rampant cross-contamination, often exposing vulnerable, malnourished populations to entirely new risks just by walking through the door.
So while Christian Europe was focusing heavily on charity, providing shelter and saving the soul, a completely different approach was brewing to the east. The Islamic world was about to merge the concept of civic charity with rigorous empirical medical science.
Kicking off the Islamic golden age of medicine.
Right. The foundation for this incredible merger was actually laid in Persia at the Academy of Gundashore, which was established in 529.
Yes, and that location is key. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I closed the ancient philosophical schools in Athens, many Nestorian Christian scholars fled east to Gandhishapur to escape persecution,
And they brought with them priceless ancient Greek medical texts.
which they systematically translated into Syriac and Persian. These texts eventually merged with sophisticated Indian medical knowledge, brought by visiting figures like the renowned physician Manka.
This created a profound, unprecedented synthesis of global medical understanding in one location.
It really did, and the synthesis gave rise to an institution called the Bimaristan, which is a Persian word combining Bimar, meaning sick, and stan, meaning place.
The sources emphasize that these institutions were entirely different from the monastic hospices of Europe. They were largely secular, highly urbanized structures that were open to everyone.
Yes, it didn't matter what your gender was, whether you were Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, or whether you were rich or completely destitute. If you were sick, you were admitted.
The operational success and longevity of the Bimaristan system was tied directly to a brilliant economic funding model. They were supported by waqfs.
Which is a very specific legal mechanism.
Right, a waqf is a type of inalienable charitable trust, deeply rooted in Islamic jurisprudence. A wealthy donor would allocate the revenues from dedicated properties, such as agricultural lands, bustling markets, or commercial buildings, to sustain the hospital indefinitely.
Let's extend an analogy here to make sure we grasp how powerful this is. The WAC system functions exactly like a modern university endowment.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it.
Hmm.
If someone wants to fund a university today, they don't just hand over a pile of cash that eventually runs out.
Right.
They gift a portfolio of investments, and the university operates using only the interest or the revenue generated by that portfolio.
That is the perfect comparison. Because the hospital's budget came from the rent of a local bakery or the harvest of a specific farm, it didn't matter if the local ruler was overthrown or if state taxes were redirected to fight a war.
The hospital had guaranteed independent income.
Exactly. This financial independence allowed Islamic hospitals to focus purely on patient care, extensive scientific research, and paying highly competitive salaries to their medical staff without any political interference.
This stable funding allowed the Abbasid Caliphate to build some truly remarkable institutions. The first general hospital in Baghdad was built in 805 by Caliph Harun al-Rashid.
Yes.
By the 10th century, Baghdad's hospital system was so advanced it sounds almost modern. They passed strict laws requiring the main hospitals to remain open 24 hours a day.
Just like today.
Yeah. The central facility employed 25 full-time staff physicians. They even established mobile medical units, staffed by traveling doctors and pharmacists, to serve remote villages and prisons that didn't have permanent clinics.
The structural organization of these buildings is what really stands out to medical historians. Unlike the European hospices, where everyone was crowded into one main hall, the Bimaristans featured highly specialized wards for specific systemic diseases.
So they separated patients based on their illness.
Yes, they had wards specifically for fevers, separate wards for digestive issues, dedicated wings for complex surgery, and specific areas for orthopedics and setting broken bones.
And they didn't ignore mental health.
Not at all. They actually opened the first dedicated psychiatric hospital in Baghdad as early as 705, recognizing mental illness not as demonic possession, but as a physiological condition requiring compassionate medical care.
To see the absolute pinnacle of this system, the sources point us to the Mansouri Hospital. This was part of a massive complex built in Cairo in 1284 by Sultan Qalawun.
The scale of the Mansouri Hospital is just hard to comprehend for the medieval period.
It served up to 4,000 patients daily. It featured separate wards for different diseases, elaborate cooling fountains placed directly in the fever wards to lower the ambient temperature, and professional musicians hired to play lutes softly in the courtyards as a form of music therapy to soothe the sick.
And there's another detail that is truly astonishing.
What's that?
Upon discharge, patients were given a stipend.
Wait, they were paid to leave.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A sum of money sufficient to cover their immediate living expenses so they wouldn't have to rush back to manual labor before they were fully healed.
Providing a discharge stipend is a level of holistic patient care that many modern healthcare systems in the 21st century still struggle to achieve.
It really is. And they were equally rigorous about their education and professional standards. You couldn't just call yourself a doctor. They required mandatory licensing exams administered by a government-appointed chief medical officer.
So it was highly regulated.
Very. Medical students had to write original treatises, undergo practical clinical interviews, and study anatomy extensively.
This environment fostered a culture of aggressive empirical research. You have legendary polymaths like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and Al-Razi, who championed early forms of clinical trials and rigorous observation.
Yes, Ibn Sina wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text so foundational it was used in European medical schools for centuries.
He stressed pulse diagnosis and testing pharmacology based on repeatable observations, rather than relying solely on the theoretical deductions of the ancient Greeks.
Right. The Bimaristan was clearly not just a place to rest. It was an active, buzzing center of scientific inquiry.
Now we have to contrast this highly organized, specialized, and largely secular Islamic system with what was happening concurrently back in medieval Europe. European care was deeply integrated with monastic life. The monasteries essentially held a total monopoly on medical texts and healthcare infrastructure.
Well, that monopoly was born out of necessity. Following the total collapse of the Western Roman Empire and its civic institutions, the preservation of written knowledge fell almost entirely to the Catholic Church.
Saint Benedict of Nursia founded the famous monastery at Monte Cassino in 543.
Yes. He wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, which explicitly mandated the moral obligation of monks to care for the sick above all other duties. Consequently, monasteries developed the infirmarium, a dedicated space for healthcare.
And we can see exactly how they planned this by looking at the St. Gall plan.
Right, this is a famous architectural drawing of an ideal monastery from the 9th century.
And it details highly specific, segregated halls for the sick, heated baths, a pharmacy, and dedicated, carefully mapped herbal gardens for growing medicinal plants.
When we look at this era of European history, there is a very common narrative that gets repeated. The assumption is that there was a rigid, hostile divide between sacred medicine, which was prayer, relics, and miracles, and profane medicine, which was herbs, surgery, and physical intervention.
The popular myth is that the medieval church actively suppressed bodily medicine, believing that suffering was good for the soul. Is that actually an accurate picture of how a medieval patient was treated?
It's a very persistent misconception, mostly invented later to make medieval people look backward, and it really needs correcting. The reality on the ground was a highly syncretic, integrated approach.
Okay, how so?
In the medieval worldview, the physical body and the immortal soul were viewed as deeply, inextricably interconnected, not as opposing forces. If your soul was sick, your body would manifest illness. If your body was sick, it distracted your soul from God.
So from the perspective of a patient living in the Middle Ages, Going to a priest to confess a sin or embarking on a long pilgrimage to a shrine was considered just as valid and just as necessary a therapeutic strategy as taking a prescribed herbal tincture or undergoing bloodletting.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The practitioners of the time utilized a massive plurality of care. They used Galenic medicine, which was based on balancing the four humors blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm.
They believed that illness was a physical imbalance of these fluids.
Right. So a doctor might prescribe a diet to balance your humors, apply leeches to remove excess blood, instruct you to pray to a specific saint, and perhaps even give you a blessed amulet to wear. To them, these were not contradictory treatments. They were all necessary tools in a comprehensive medical toolkit.
So the medieval patient is aggressively utilizing this plurality of care, taking whatever works from different traditions.
Yeah.
As Europe moves out of the Dark Ages and into the 12th and 13th centuries, we see a massive demographic shift.
The population surges.
Exactly. Urbanization accelerates and cities begin to swell. This drives a massive expansion of hospitals, and we start seeing the foundation of enormous, enduring civic hospitals that are actually still recognizable today.
The shift toward dense cities necessitated much larger civic institutions because the small monastic infirmaries simply couldn't handle the volume of patients.
In London, St. Bartholomew's Hospital was founded in 1123. The sources tell a great story about its founding.
Oh, the story of Rahir.
Yeah. It was built by a courtier named Rahir, who took a solemn vow to build a hospital for the poor after surviving a terrifying bout of malaria while on a pilgrimage to Rome.
And in Paris, the Hôtel Dieu, which translates to the Hostel of God, was established all the way back in 829, but expanded significantly during this urban boom to become a massive complex right next to Notre Dame.
We also see the papacy getting directly involved in public health. Pope Innocent III spurred a major hospital building movement, actively encouraging the creation of Holy Ghost hospitals across Europe. A prime example is the Santo Spirito in Sassia, built in Rome in 1198, which featured vast wards lined with beds.
As these urban centers grew, a very nuanced lexicon of healers emerged. You couldn't just walk out into the street and yell for a doctor. The sources identify several distinct professions.
Right. First, you had the physicians.
These were the elite, university-educated physicians who focused almost entirely on theory, diet, and pharmacopoeia. They rarely touched the patient.
Then you had the surgeons,
Who were considered skilled tradesmen, much lower in status, who handled the messy physical interventions like setting bones or amputations.
and crucially, you had the pharmacists or apothecaries.
During this period, pharmacists were primarily considered merchants. By law, they were licensed to mix and prepare raw drugs strictly under the guidance of the educated physicians.
However, human nature being what it is, the reality on the ground was quite different. Patients often went directly to the pharmacist for treatment, bypassing the physicians entirely.
Let me guess. The university-educated physician charged exorbitant fees, and the common people couldn't afford them.
Exactly. The physicians charged high fees and usually prescribed lengthy, complicated lifestyle interventions that a working-class person couldn't adhere to.
Right.
By going straight to the pharmacist, a patient could get a quick, cheap, symptomatic remedy for their cough or their stomachache without having to pay for a long lecture on balancing their humors.
This integrated, church-funded, and highly pluralistic system dominated Europe for centuries. It provided a safety net for millions. But the sources show that this entire system was completely upended, and in some places entirely destroyed, by the cultural and religious earthquakes of the 16th century, namely the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation.
The Renaissance brought a gradual shift towards civic and lay control of hospitals, particularly in the wealthy city-states of Italy.
Yeah.
We see the rise of powerful charitable confraternities, groups of wealthy lay citizens managing massive institutions like the Ospedale Civil in Venice.
This era also saw the integration of rigorous, hands-on anatomical study into medical education. In 1594, the University of Padua established Europe's first permanent anatomical theater.
And they were sourcing the cadavers for these theaters directly from the local hospitals. This is the era of Andreas Vesalius, who published his hyper-detailed anatomical texts in 1543.
He challenged centuries of ancient Greek errors by actually performing human dissections himself.
You also have radical figures like Paracelsus roaming around Europe, burning ancient medical textbooks and advocating for chemical therapies using toxic minerals and metals like mercury.
So on one hand, medical theory and anatomical knowledge were advancing rapidly, but on the other hand, the institutional framework that actually provided daily care to the sick was facing a devastating, catastrophic disruption in Northern Europe due to the Protestant Reformation.
The theological shift was the root cause. Protestantism argued for salvation through faith alone, shifting away from the Catholic doctrine of salvation through good works and charity.
This theological shift instantly eliminated the primary motivation for wealthy individuals to endow monasteries, chantries, and hospitals.
Right. If funding a hospital doesn't buy your way out of purgatory, the funding dries up.
The impact in England was immediate, severe, and frankly, brutal. Between 1536 and 1541, King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries.
He seized the wealth and dissolved over 800 religious houses across the country. In doing so, he effectively destroyed overnight the entire hospital and alms system that had supported the poor, the elderly, and the sick for centuries.
The social fallout was an absolute crisis. Imagine waking up one day and finding that every single free clinic, homeless shelter, and orphanage in your country has been boarded up and its assets seized by the government.
That's a massive societal collapse.
It was. Without the monastic infirmaries, England experienced massive vagrancy. Thousands of untreated, sick individuals were left to die in the streets. The civic authorities were completely unprepared and utterly unequipped to fill the massive void left by the church.
The situation got so desperate that it eventually necessitated the creation of the Elizabethan Poor Law in 1601, which mandated that local parishes raise taxes to provide relief. However, this secular system fundamentally changed the nature of care.
Yes.
It heavily prioritized building punitive workhouses to force the able-bodied poor into labor, rather than building dedicated healing facilities for the sick.
The transition was incredibly harsh. Famous institutions like St. Bartholomew's in London only survived this purge by a hair. The local citizens literally had to petition the king in 1544, begging him to restore the hospital charter so they had somewhere to put the sick and dying who were overwhelming the city streets.
There is a terrifying dark irony to this entire era. Thanks to the printing press disseminating texts like those by Vesalius, medical knowledge regarding human anatomy and physiology was rapidly advancing. Doctors knew more about the body than ever before. Yet, if you look at the sources, actual patient outcomes inside the surviving hospitals were arguably getting significantly worse.
They were becoming death traps. The loss of vast institutional funding meant that the few surviving civic hospitals were severely under-resourced and drastically overcrowded. Furthermore, without an understanding of germ theory, these massive facilities were lethal.
Due to miasma theory.
Exactly. The prevailing medical theory of the time relied on miasma, the idea that diseases were caused by breathing in bad air or foul odors emanating from rotting matter. Consequently, they didn't wash their hands, they didn't sterilize instruments, and cross-infections were absolutely rampant.
If you went to a hospital for a broken leg, you were highly likely to catch a fatal fever from the patient in the bed next to you.
The sources note that infant mortality in these settings was appalling, frequently reaching 140 deaths per 1,000 live births. Hospitals were still largely perceived by the public as dreaded places where the destitute went to die, rather than places where people went to be cured.
That bleak, terrifying reality persists for hundreds of years, right up until we cross into the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the turning point. This is when a series of rapid technological breakthroughs finally transform the hospital from an almshouse into a machine for curing. We see the true mechanization of medicine.
Early on in this period, we see developments in the American colonies, such as the founding of the Pennsylvania Hospital in 1751, spearheaded by figures like Benjamin Franklin to care for the sick poor.
The shift toward empirical prevention and aggressive surgical intervention rapidly accelerates. A prime example of this empirical shift occurs in 1796 with the English doctor Edward Jenner.
Jenner was investigating a piece of country folklore. He noticed that milkmaids who worked closely with cows almost never caught smallpox, which was one of the most terrifying, disfiguring, and lethal diseases on Earth.
Right.
He hypothesized that their prior exposure to cowpox, which was a much milder animal disease that caused sores on their hands, somehow granted them immunity to the deadly human smallpox.
The way he tested this hypothesis is a dramatic vignette that would never pass an ethics board today. He found a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms who had active cowpox lesions. He extracted the pus from her sores.
And then?
He then found an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps, the son of his gardener, and deliberately inserted the infected cowpox pus into the boy's arm.
That is an intense method.
Yeah. The boy got a mild fever and recovered. Then came the terrifying part. Jenner deliberately exposed the boy to lethal smallpox, and the boy was completely immune.
It was a monumental breakthrough in preventative medicine. Jenner coined the term vaccination to describe the procedure, deriving it from vacca, the Latin word for cow.
But while vaccination began to address the scourge of infectious viral disease, the actual practice of surgery inside a hospital remained a brutal, horrifying ordeal.
Before the mid-19th century, there was no effective way to stop pain. Anesthesia consisted of getting the patient blackout drunk on alcohol, administering heavy doses of opium if you could afford it, or, in some ancient and military contexts, literally hitting the patient on the head with a wooden mallet to induce a concussion.
Just think about the sheer terror of lying on a wooden table, fully awake while a surgeon prepares to amputate your leg. Surgery was essentially a gruesome race against the patient's capacity to endure sheer agony before going into fatal shock.
The speed of the surgeon was the primary and really the only metric of success. A great surgeon was one who could saw off a limb in under 2 minutes.
The advent of general anesthesia fundamentally and permanently altered the surgical landscape, and by extension, the entire purpose of the hospital. The watershed moment occurred on October 16, 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital, in an operating amphitheater now famously known as the Ether Dome.
Right.
A dentist named William T.G. Morton publicly demonstrated the use of inhaled diethyl ether on a patient. As the patient inhaled the gas, he was rendered completely insensible to pain, allowing the surgeon to methodically and calmly remove a tumor from his neck without the patient screaming or thrashing.
The dissemination of this technique was incredibly rapid. The news spread across the Atlantic, and by November 1847, the Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson introduced the use of chloroform, applying it particularly in obstetrics to ease the agonizing pain of childbirth.
Anesthesia solved the immediate horrific problem of surgical shock and pain. It allowed surgeons to slow down. They could perform longer, much more complex, and deeply exploratory procedures, such as ovariotomies and major limb reconstructions, that were previously physically impossible because the patient would have died of pain.
However, we have to note that the hospital was not yet completely safe. Patients now survive the surgery without feeling pain, only to face a horrific 40 to 50% mortality rate from postoperative sepsis in the days following the operation.
Because the surgeons were still operating in street clothes with unwashed hands.
Exactly. It was not until the widespread adoption of antisepsis, pushed by Joseph Lister, and the acceptance of germ theory in the late 19th century that postoperative infections were finally curtailed.
Once they stopped the massive infection rates, the diagnostic tools evolved at a breakneck pace, finalizing the transition into the modern era. We see Wilhelm Röntgen discovering X-rays in 1895, which for the first time allowed doctors to non-invasively visualize the internal skeleton without cutting the patient open.
And then, in 1901, Karl Landsteiner identifies the ABO blood groups. This discovery finally explains why early blood transfusions kept killing people, and it makes transfusions safe and reliable, allowing for even more massive surgeries.
So let me ask you this. How did these highly specific scientific discoveries fundamentally change the physical architecture and the societal role of the hospital building itself?
Well, think about what X-ray machines, sterile surgical theaters, and blood banking require. They require massive, specialized, heavy equipment. They require tightly controlled sterile environments, electricity, and dedicated chemical laboratories.
None of which could be replicated in a patient's private home.
Precisely. The hospital definitively completed its transition. It was no longer a custodial almshouse for the destitute who had nowhere else to go to die. It became a centralized hub for complex technological interventions.
And because the life-saving technology was centralized in this one building, the hospital became a necessary, unavoidable destination for all classes of society. Rich and poor alike, kings and laborers, everyone had to go to the hospital when facing serious illness or requiring surgery. This is where it gets really interesting, because we have been on a massive historical journey today. We started by exploring the tranquil, snake-filled sleep temples of ancient Greece. We moved through the charitable, prayer-filled monasteries of the Middle Ages. We discussed the incredibly advanced, specialized, secular bimaristans of the Islamic Golden Age.
And we finally arrived at the sterile, brightly lit surgical theaters of the 19th and 20th centuries.
We witnessed the hospital evolve from a place of spiritual sanctuary and holistic lifestyle adjustment into a highly engineered, purely scientific machine for curing specific physical ailments.
It represents a massive philosophical shift from the ancient biopsychosocial model to a strictly mechanistic model of health. Throughout the 20th century, the focus of the hospital was almost entirely on treating the human body as a complex machine with broken parts that needed to be chemically, radiologically, or surgically fixed in a sterile environment.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought for you to mull over the next time you walk through those automatic hospital doors. While the 20th century perfected the mechanistic hospital, modern medicine is increasingly looking backward to move forward. If you look at the newest hospital designs being built today, we are seeing a massive push to reintegrate nature, natural light, specific architectural flows, mental health support, and holistic wellness back into the physical design of the building.
It's coming full circle.
It raises a fascinating question. As we build the advanced hospitals of the future, are we finally realizing that the ancient Greek Asclepiads, with their tranquil gardens, thermal baths, and intense focus on the patient's entire psychological environment, might have had the right idea all along? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.